Hello everyone and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch and another MMM debate episode. So this is on a Vex question and it draws from many of the central themes of the show. So not just feminism but also religion and history and politics. Is the question of whether or not the centrality of abortion rights in feminist campaigning in the post-second wave era is correct, is legitimate. Is it true to say that women need access to abortion, safe legal abortion, in order to flourish? Is it essential to women's flourishing? No, I've not said freedom, because freedom is a very vexed word. I'm sure we'll get into this over the course of the conversation. But do women need access to abortion in order to achieve their full flourishing? I have two guests here who come at the question from different angles. The first is Furedi. She's a writer and activist, author of the book The Moral Case for Abortion, and former chief executive of the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, which is the largest abortion provider in the UK. On the other side, I have Leah Libresco Sargeant. She's the author, most recently, of The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto, and she also writes the Substack Other Feminisms and works in family policy in Washington D.C. I'm going to start with a question for both of you, which I hope you'll have different answers to. We had this wave of changes in legislation across the Anglosphere and other parts of the West as well, but just sticking with the Anglosphere because that's where listeners are going to be generally. In the 1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s, Britain, the US, Australia, all these countries changed the law on abortion. And obviously there have been subsequent tweaks to the law, but the big change comes then. And maybe I'll ask you first, Anne, why do you think that happened then? What was it about that moment in terms of the political climate, the ideological climate of the time, that made every jurisdiction reach the same conclusion about abortion law?
The conclusions that really political establishments reached about abortion was probably different in different places, and I'm sure that we'll come on to that. But in England, I think it is really interesting because it had absolutely nothing at all to do with feminism. It had nothing to do with the women's rights movement. In fact, it had nothing to do with the idea of women's liberation at all. It preceded that. The women's liberation movement in Britain was very much the early, mid-1970s, but the abortion law, the real campaign to change the abortion law, was through the 1960s, and the law changed in 1967. And it was driven partly because of reasons of women's health, partly because to do with the need to exert control over abortions that were already happening. And it was the case that before abortion was legal, just before abortion was legalized, there was a massive increase in backstreet, back alley abortions. There were literally tens of thousands of women who were ending up in hospital beds as a result of that. And weirdly, even before the law changed, there were a lot of abortions that were being done in National Health Service hospitals, about 10,000 a year by doctors. And really the law was about regulating it and basically saying, well, this is going on. How do we control who has abortions and when? And the parameters of that law were not at all set up about sort of women's freedom. They were set up around an idea of good motherhood. And so the law was never about the woman's right. It was basically saying a woman can have an abortion if it would be damaging to her health or the health of her existing children. if she went on and had the child, or indeed if the child were going to be born severely disabled. And when people look back, they say, well, actually, that was a real eugenic law. It came in at the time of changes in housing and so on. And it was about really trying to solve the problems of poor women who government officials thought would be unfit mothers. And that is really how it all started. And of course, the agenda has changed significantly since then. But in the States, I think it was very different.
Before I turn to you, Leah, do you think that surge in backstreet abortions and even abortions happening within NHS hospitals, do we know why that happened? Why did that immediately precede the 67 Act?
I think it preceded the 67 Act because, first of all, doctors were realizing that the reason why it was happening in hospitals was that doctors were realizing that abortions could be performed safely, and they felt that probably it was better for women to be having a legal abortion than struggling with a child that they didn't want. The reason why it was happening more informally, more in the back streets, was because I think a lot of poor women were beginning to get the idea that they needed to regulate their family size. And ironically, that was a time when you couldn't get other contraceptive methods. You could end a pregnancy in some ways more easily than you could prevent them. And so, as the demand to, I suppose, do something to limit your family came more and more to the front, so did the idea of ending a pregnancy more perhaps than trying to prevent one.
Leah, can I turn to you? So with the same question, what was it about that moment that led to this cascade of legal changes across the Anglosphere?
Yeah, I think that question of abortion and contraception is a great place for me to pick up. In America, there was a famous Supreme Court case, Griswold v. Connecticut, that happened in 1965 that really legalized access to contraception on a broad scale. Before that, states had had the ability to prohibit it, to limit it to married couples. In practice, this wasn't really done all the time. Something that's a little funny is it was hard to get plaintiffs for this case because there were several women's activists who were trying to sell contraceptives illegally, to be arrested, to start a case, and the police declined to arrest them. So it's one of those cases where the mix of what the law was on fact and versus what the law was on the ground was muddled, right? But the more you have this culture of common legalized contraception, especially with the pill, the more there is an expectation. There's a lot of sex that everyone involved in it expects shouldn't lead to a baby. And I think contraceptives have gotten more effective over time, but a number of those early ones, especially as used by people typically, obviously predictably result in babies for some people. While they're trying in good faith to avoid conception, it will happen. And then the question is, what happens to the baby that both people did not intend to conceive, but nevertheless did conceive? So Griswold is in 1965, massively loosening access to contraception. Roe v. Wade, the case that found a right to an abortion during parts of pregnancy, is in 1972. And what's going on in between in America is, first of all, there are strong sympathetic cases that come to the fore in the media. And I think this is often the case. It's a narrow slice of possible abortions that are driving a lot of the discussion about loosening broad laws. So you'll find women who have a baby that they expect not to survive birth. And that's the question of, should this woman be able to seek an abortion in the US, or if she's a prominent woman, is she going abroad and making the papers and forcing this question about what do we want to happen in our country? There are definitely folks pushing for legalized abortion on demand for a variety of reasons, but a lot of the push to liberalize in particular states start with narrow cases that people are sympathetic to. And then people often find that it's tricky to figure out, well, what is the legal regime we do agree on? Once we open the door to legal abortion, do we want it just in these hard cases? Do we know we can write laws that differentiate between the cases, et cetera? And in the meantime, the historian Daniel K. Williams has a wonderful book coming out the same day as mine, October 1st, called Abortion in America's Churches. And he actually connects some of the internal division in American Protestantism about abortion to debates that are happening about the rights of the person after World War II. He sees this tradition in the global discussion about what is it that gives a person value in the wake of the Holocaust, and a desire in an increasingly secular and pluralistic world to find a grounding for value that doesn't depend on pointing to God, but depends on something else about a person. And one of the ways of talking about the value of a person that became increasingly prevalent was, well, a person is valued by someone else. When you engage in indiscriminate war against civilians, you're not only harming the person killed, you're harming the whole community they're a part of, because there are people who love them, who don't want to lose them. But what Williams found is that as that kind of discussion of our value comes from being loved became more prevalent, it actually really eroded some denominations' ability to make the case for the human person in the womb. Because after all, why is this baby vulnerable to abortion? It's because both the mother and the father in many cases say, well, we don't want this person to continue to exist. And who has the claim to say, well, I love this baby who I haven't met, and therefore they have value because they are loved by me? There was more of a discussion saying, well, we're trying to articulate this theory of human rights, and it comes from being connected to others. So if you're not connected or you're rejected from others, do we have a case to defend your life at all? That's a very intra-Protestant discussion that's happening in America. That's not the whole tenor of the abortion debate. But I really appreciate the connection he made to that struggle to articulate, how do we define the value of someone who is vulnerable and what definitions leave people out? Ultimately, when the case came to the Supreme Court, it turned on this kind of very wacky constitutional theory of privacy, which I think a lot of abortion advocates and people who oppose abortion all found bizarre. But this is what happens often at the Supreme Court. To get a decision that will attract enough support from different justices, you wind up with something everyone can compromise on, not necessarily something everyone is satisfied with. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who wasn't on the court at the time, but was a very strong advocate of women's rights, abortion rights, had a lot of cases that she took that I agree with strongly, and abortion obviously being the one where I disagree with her. She thought the best grounding, and one of the ones that was being articulated by advocates, even not ratified by the Supreme Court, was an equal protection grounding. That we're seeing case after case where women are not treated equally, not given equal protection under the law at that time. And you're making progress against each of these unequal protection grounds. Women couldn't be flight attendants once they were married, while men could remain flight attendants after they were married. And the justification for this was kind of, well, they're not as desirable if everyone knows they're married. It was just case after case where you had these real equal protection grounds that I'm very grateful I live in a post-Ruth Bader Ginsburg world for those reasons. But for her, abortion was also an equal protection case. It fit into this overall story of how do we treat men and women equally under the law. And where she and I diverge, we agree empirically that men have a greater ability, just practically, to abandon a baby they do not want to be connected to than a woman does. My kids are really into Les Mis right now, so their primary example of cowardice is Cosette's father, because he leaves Fantine before Cosette is born, and they're like, yes, one of the worst villains in Les Mis, even though he's never on stage. But a man has that ability to abandon someone who is his child. A woman, empirically, descriptively, does not have the same freedom to walk away from a baby, because for a man to walk away only requires cowardice. But for a woman to walk away requires an intervention, whether a medical intervention, an abortion pill, a surgical intervention. It requires something to stop the baby from depending on her anymore. She can't walk away. For Ginsburg, that was another equal protection case. Men and women could not be equal in society unless they enjoyed the same freedoms here to be free of someone who depended on them. I think that's remained a strong current in the feminist case for abortion. And for me, it's not that I disagree descriptively. I think it's true that men have a greater freedom of vice here. But I don't think the solution for women or children is to help women reach that low.
Something you said, Anne, which I really appreciated, because I think this often gets mistaken in a lot of the popular histories. The legalization of abortion, certainly in Britain, preceded feminism really getting underway, preceded second wave feminism really getting underway. And I think that it's fair to say that the same is true in the States, even though it was a little bit later with Roe in 72.
I wouldn't agree with this. I think there's a lot going on for kind of the nascent feminist movement, including, I just want to highlight one thing where I disagree with the practitioners, but kind of agree with their methods. You have, prior to Roe, you've got the Janes, which are a network of underground abortion providers who are women who are interested not just in providing abortions, which I think women need, but freeing women from dependence on exploitative abortion providers who are charging them a lot of money, not giving them safe provision. And I think you see that as continuous with the feminist movement rising before Roe, the sense of how can women unite for each other, take care of each other, build parallel communities when they need to supplement or provide alternatives to unjust systems you're participating in. And you see, a parallel also to the American civil rights movement for African Americans, the sense of part of our movement is about breaking the law and then being willing to take some of the consequences of breaking the law to highlight the injustice of the law. So in America, I think there's a lot of feminism happening before you have legalized abortion. And there's real courage and self-sacrifice in it that I admire. I just wish it were directed to ends I support.
I think that is true in the United States. I think what people often don't quite get with the British law, and it's still the same in some ways quite shockingly, that it actually did nothing about providing women with any rights at all. The legal discussion wasn't even about giving a woman a right to abortion at any stage in pregnancy, not even the earliest weeks. What the law did was to give an ability, a professional ability for doctors to make a decision whether or not they felt that a woman fitted the right kind of woman to be able to have an abortion. So even now, and of course now it's interpreted incredibly loosely, because most doctors believe that if a pregnant woman who's requesting an abortion is compelled to have a child she doesn't want, they believe that that will be damaging to her mental health. But the law was about the protection of doctors. It was saying, and it needed 2 doctors. Unlike any other medical procedure, an abortion is only legal if 2 doctors agree that a woman meets criteria defined in law, which wouldn't have happened if it had been a woman's rights issue. And I think it's one of the things that in Britain has been both a massive problem, because on the one hand, a woman's right to regulate her own fertility was never actually, using abortion was never actually agreed upon. Abortion always was a very bright line away from contraception to that extent. But in some ways, the law in Britain, the forming of it as a health matter rather than a political status of women matter, I think has in many ways meant that there hasn't been the head-to-head, the polarization in a rights movement, because in Britain, the easy way out of an abortion discussion is simply to say, who are you to stand between a woman and her doctors? If 2 doctors believe it's in the best interests of her medical health, how can you possibly disagree with that? And so very often the debates and the contestation in Britain has taken place in the area of health, with more latterly anti-choice organizations saying, oh yes, but abortion damages women's health, and so on. And so it's been that backwards and forwards, but women's rights were much less at the forefront. And for my mind, I actually think it's a problem, because you can see that happens now, that very often an argument from the and it's hard to use these terms like pro-choice and so on, because the meaning of the language has really shifted over the decades as well. But when I'm talking about pro-choice in this circumstance, I'm talking about women who believe that it should be for a woman to make her own decision about whether a pregnancy continues. And those people who do believe that have now, I feel, to the detriment of a helpful discussion, are insisting it's just a health issue. Abortion is just a health issue. It's not a moral issue. And of course, abortion's a moral issue because, as Leah was saying earlier, it goes back to how you value human life, what is human about human life, when it begins, when it ends, when does it begin to matter. All of those things, I believe, are deeply, deeply moral questions, and who you allow to make the decision, for me, is a really deeply moral question. But it seems as though what's happened is that the two sides of an argument almost pursue different tracks. And while there has been a pull of the debate onto the health track, there seems to be less of a pull onto the moral track. And I would like to see more discussion of that there.
I wonder if this is where there's a slight difference between countries, because in Britain there is this abortion has never really been a hot button political topic. It's never really been has anything like the vehemence of the American debate. I'm not quite sure why that is, whether it's something to do with British people not wanting to talk about religion and politics quite as vehemently, I don't know. Or I mean, the thing that I keep coming back to when thinking about this moment in the 60s and 70s where you see a moral revolution, and it's not just about abortion, it's about all sorts of things. You see it at the same time as, say, decriminalization of homosexuality and various other feminist issues, that some of which Leah has already raised. This all happens at the same time. And some of what you're seeing is probably material and has something to do with the pill. That's always been my assumption, that there's something about the pill loosens that conceptual link between sex and reproduction. And then that paves the way in some fashion for abortion to become less stigmatized, maybe. But there's something also to do with Christianity, right? There's something to do with Christians have an anthropologically unusual opposition to abortion and also to infanticide. And it's during the 60s and the 70s that the Christian grip on institutions really starts to falter. And now we're at a point where I think it's, even in America, it has faltered to a remarkable degree. If we look at how people thought about these questions, say 100 years ago, not 50 years ago. And I don't want us to get, I think there's a bit of me that thinks I don't want to get too into the weeds about these questions of Christianity, because obviously that's a big question. But it feels impossible to ignore for me. And I've always thought that the reason surely why abortion is such a vexed political question, particularly in America, is because it's not just about abortion, it's about Christianity. It's about this really big question of whether or not the country ought to remain Christian. And I guess it's in the 60s and 70s that so many people start answering with a no, it shouldn't.
I do think one thing that Leah said earlier is really important. And a lot of people will disagree with this, but empirically, I think it's really true. And that is that once we get to a situation where couples, women, whatever, feel that they can regulate their fertility through contraception, there is an expectation that if contraception fails, as it does, because we fail to use it and it does still work sometimes, if it fails, then abortion should be available as a backup. And it almost reinforces the idea that the timing and the number of pregnancies is something that should be under our control. And it seems to me that is just so manifestly obvious. People have argued that no contraception prevents abortion. And on one level, you can say that it does, that if you're using contraception, then you might not get pregnant and need an abortion. But it is definitely the case that there is a transformation of a world that we live in now that basically means we expect sex to be without consequences. And I think that fits in to a very different mindset to one where marriage and the family and long-lasting relationships are seen important. Sex becomes recreational. And I think that there's a very, very big difference that comes about then. Whether you think it's right or wrong is a moot point, but I think that's what happens.
I think that is a huge part of it. But I think the other thing, particularly in the American context, has to do with the framework we were given by the Supreme Court for weighing these questions and what that kind of communicated about these moral questions, I think does implicate what's different about the American context and the British context. So in America, the framework wasn't just about doctors. Doctors had a role in it, but it wasn't just, well, when a doctor thinks it's necessary, it's legal, and when they don't, they don't. So this is primarily a medical question. The Supreme Court initially had a unwieldy trimester framework of, no regulation of abortion pretty much in the first trimester. Some in the second trimester, don't do it in the third trimester. And these weren't very reasoned, there's nothing magic that happens at the 12th or 13th week, in this way. And I think it wasn't very satisfying. So, they kept coming back to the court, and then the court revised its framework and imposed later a viability framework, which was that there should be kind of broad access to abortion prior to viability and very limited, but not none after viability. And this really does put forward a moral case of what's going on, not just a moral theory of sex, which is that sex should be something that doesn't result in a baby. You have the freedom to make sure it doesn't, even if something goes wrong with your contraception. Viability is kind of a weird term because, of course, a baby after delivery is not viable in any meaningful sense, in that the baby is not independent. The baby can't feed him or herself, can't clothe him or herself, can't move. So what changes after delivery and what changes after viability is that the baby is utterly dependent, but can be dependent on someone other than the mother. So again, we don't as much just have this sense of viability as the main thing, autonomy is the main thing. That's not on the table for a baby either way, pre or post viability, pre or post delivery. It's a question of how much can any one person be asked? When only the mother can succor this baby, that's an injustice to her. But once it is possible for her to disclaim the baby, deliver the baby, pass the baby to someone else, then the law can protect the baby as long as someone else is willing to take care of it. Now, for children, that's less of a problem. In the United States, there are way more parents who hope to adopt a baby than there are babies up for adoption. So there's kind of never the moral problem of what do we do with people who need a lot, but are unwanted or cannot be cared for by the person who is their most natural relation. But we do run into that problem at the end of life. And I know this is coming up for you guys a lot in England now, where you have someone who is very dependent, who is not going to cross a line of viability. An older person is not going to suddenly get better where their moral status changes. And either they're in a position where the people who are the most natural ones to care for them, their family, don't want to, genuinely can't. There can be bigger demands than any one family can meet. Or increasingly in America, where the person themselves who can speak for themselves says, well, I don't want to be cared for. I think I require so much from someone that it is unjust for me to ask my children to care for me, just like it might be unjust for a baby who can't speak to ask his or her mother to care for them. And so that's where I think, we look at not just the starts of access to abortion, but the ripples of access to abortion. I think that argument in the US of viability, dependence, the burden placed on a particular person, unpersoning the person who needs so much, is really driving a lot of our debate about the moral implications or duties of euthanasia.
Christianity is, in the words of Tom Holland, the most disruptive, the most influential, and the most enduring revolution in history. And we are all children of this revolution, whether we go to church or not. That's why it makes sense to get to grips with Christian faith, whatever your background. And 321 is a fantastic way to do that. 321 is an online course presented by Glenn Scrivener, who you might know from this podcast. It's engaging, imaginative, and assumes no prior knowledge. Binge it in a couple of hours or take your time over 8 sessions. It's completely free. Go to 321course.com/MMM, enter your email, set a password, and you're in. No spam, no cost, just an invitation to look at life again through the lens of Jesus. Whether you're looking for an introduction to Christianity for yourself or looking to introduce others, find out more for free at 321course.com/MMM.
Can I ask you something before you raised so much, and I really hope we're going to go on to talk about some of these sort of viability issues and so on, because it's so interesting. But one thing that struck me was when you were talking about the American law and you were talking about Roe v. Wade, you dismissed something almost by a sleight of hand that for me was actually the most compelling thing about Roe v. Wade. And it's the point that you made about privacy, because when it comes to the whole abortion debate, and no matter at what stage in pregnancy, one of the things, and it was kind of like a core that run through my work on the moral case for abortion, is the issue of who decides, and the difference between our private world of our own decisions of conscience and our own family life, and the boundaries of the state to be able to interfere within that. So for me, freedom of conscience, that personal private belief, is and the ability to act on that is paramount. And there has to be a very, very compelling reason for the state, for public life, to interfere and cut that down. And I always found that the paragraphs that were written into the Roe v. Wade decision about the limitations on the state to interfere with decisions of conscience, and particularly to interfere within the family life, were very, very, very compelling. And I find it that's actually, I think it's kind of a tragedy that Roe versus Wade was struck down for that exact point, because this whole sort of notion that I think the reason why I feel it's a problem is that when I've been talking to women in abortion clinics over the years, what I find are not women who want to have an abortion as an act of freedom. I often make the point, it's not like somebody exercises the right to abortion like the right to vote. Nobody ever wants to be there. They don't see it as positive. It's something that they're dealing with that's a problem. And so many women will say, I think abortion's really wrong, but it's the right thing for me at this time. And when they're weighing that up, they'll often talk about things like their ability to care for their existing children. I think it's probably like the most, over 20 years of working around clinics, probably women would be saying, I would have this child, and the but is often about their commitments to the family. And so for me, the whole notion that here I am pregnant, I find that to be a real problem. Somebody has to make the decision about what happens. And for me, the person who is most responsible and most invested is the woman, because she will live with that decision for the rest of her life, whether she has the child or whether she doesn't. And so for me, it's that that to me was what was great about Roe v. Wade. It basically said, here is a responsibility that is yours, rather than it being a right or a legal kind of little thing. It is something that is about your individual, that should sit outside of the law. So I was interested that that's clearly not the way that you were looking at that at all, which is fair enough. We're on different states, but
The question of privacy comes secondary to the question of justice here, right? Is this a decision people can make justly?
Yeah.
And if it isn't, then the question of privacy is less relevant. And we make some of these trade-offs, in less charged situations. And I'll just pick employment law because I think people don't bring the same level of moral vehemence on either side to employment law, where we say, all right,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's certain rights to privacy. People have different senses of what's right, but we are setting a minimum wage. And we are setting minimum work conditions. And we understand some people may say, you know what, I'm in a tough spot. I'd like to be able to accept work below the legal wage. I'd like to be able to accept work that's less safe because my state is so precarious. I feel better off accepting dangerous work in hazardous conditions that would otherwise be illegal and privately contracting for that because that will help me feed my family. And I think when we look at folks in those hard, precarious situations, our instinct is, all right, well, we've got to address that precarity that left you vulnerable to that choice, not, I think we should get rid of labor laws, which, isn't the case you're making. But, that's where when I look at those cases, and you're absolutely right. The modal woman who seeks an abortion is already a mom, right? The most common case is someone who's not just worried about the moral weight of the baby inside her, but worried about how she is living out her responsibilities to the baby she already knows and loves. And this is why, some of the pro-life advocacy, which I appreciate, but, showing people the ultrasound for these women, they've seen it. They know what happens when they carry a baby to term. They're raising that baby. They love that baby. They're afraid they're going to shortchange the baby. And I don't think either sibling is well served by saying, because we have put you in such an economically precarious position, we will allow you to kill one of your children so that you are better able to serve your surviving child. In the same way, I don't think a woman is well served, and we will allow you to take this job without personal protective device, working with hazardous chemicals for a wage that will let you take care of both children. I think the fundamental injustice is placing a mother in a position where she feels like she has to do violence to one child to save the other.
But in real life, I mean, it seems to me that in the circumstances that these women are in, we can say, well, we don't think that they should. I mean, who knows? I mean, it's interesting. I would have this baby, but I often have felt that the buts range from a number of things actually some of them are things that could be resolved quite easily through help with counseling in the abortion clinic. I would have this baby, but my mum will kill me, and then you can have a discussion with them about how they can't, and all of this, that, and the other. But some of the buts really are pretty impossible to get around in the here and now. And so the question always comes down to me to the kind of who decides. And because if it's not the woman making the decision, then it needs to be somebody else. And I don't know. I find it weird, and I'm a bit of an outlier in the movement because, God, I value, I have got such a presumption in favor of human life. I think that the miracle of conception and birth is just the most extraordinary thing. And so it seems to me that the decisions that are made around that are staggeringly important for a woman. And so for me, to override a woman's conscience and determination on that issue, whether to make her continue a pregnancy or to make her end a pregnancy, for me it's mind-blowing. I cannot imagine what it would feel like to be a woman a pregnant woman in a situation where you either refused or forced into a form of treatment. Because for me, the whole relationship that you have with your future children and with the embryo, the fetus, the baby inside of you is such a powerful thing. And I just think women feel that, which is in later pregnancy, certainly. And I think that one of the things that I think is a problem, and that I would agree is a problem, although many of my colleagues wouldn't, is that what you say has the changes that have been, I really believe, have led to a casualization of the notion of human life. And we would be as one on what you say about the ending of life. But I can't find my way to somehow endorsing anything other than a private decision about the start of a pregnancy. I'm struggling with that myself at the moment. Life was so much easier when the debate was much more simple. But I can't get myself over that notion that the woman has to make that decision.
Something that I think is interesting and under-discussed here is that for basically all of human history, abortion has been really dangerous. Part of what this contemporary debate is about, and you've raised this more or less explicitly, Anne, is the state either withholding or permitting women access to an actually very new medical service. Because historically, women have always attempted abortions, but frequently they were terribly dangerous. When you can read about ancient Roman methods of abortion, for instance, which would frequently leave women sterile or dead. Very dangerous thing to do, which I think is a big part of why infanticide was so common in antiquity and
Definitely.
Indeed in many times and places. It's really only in the 20th century that it becomes possible to perform abortion safely. And then it becomes this question of whether or not that medical process should be accessible. And that's when the state starts to become the really important arbiter on this moral question. And I agree generally, and with your instinct towards feeling like I don't want, the state, I think, is often very bad at making those kind of fine-grained personal decisions, and I don't really want the state interfering at that level. But then equally, I think maybe, Leah, this is an opportunity to talk about particularly your recent book and these broader questions about dependency and the individual. And, is it really, should we be understanding this as, is the central question, is this something that a woman is doing to her own body, or is this something a woman is doing to somebody else's body? And what is the moral distinction there?
Yeah, and this is where I think it's hard to define an understanding of the human person and who has a right to support, even when it's hard to support them, that only implicates the unborn. And where I think people have trouble drawing those lines as neatly as they want, because lots of the ways that you try to construct regrettably, this person's need poses a threat to someone else, implicates other people. Again, I think we see that very strongly in euthanasia, where we're seeing more and more drift, not just to people who are actively dying, but people with just sustained mental health issues, people with anorexia as candidates for euthanasia, because they have a difficult life that not only is difficult for them, but implicates the people who care for them. And then we don't have a strong way of articulating in the law or in the culture, why is it good for someone to live under these circumstances? And I think that kind of touches us throughout life too, not just at the beginning and end, that's where that's starkest. But I think there's a real tendency to not ask for help even in our normal circumstances of just being sick for a period of time, if we think that burdening our friends is being unjust to them and degrading to ourselves. And I think even folks who want to be compassionate kind of pick up this language, I think is deeply rooted in our abortion debate, of that if I ask my friend to do something, it's natural to say, but I don't want to be a burden to you. And that my friend doesn't say in response, oh, you are burdening me. This was hard. I canceled plans. I did it because I love you, right? They say, oh, don't worry. It was no trouble. And what we're constantly telling each other back and forth in these small, casual, unthought moments is, it would be bad if it were a burden. It would be bad if it were sufficiently disruptive to our lives. And that's why I just don't think the abortion debate can ever be contained in the abortion debate. The sense of is someone's burdensomeness a threat to their life or a threat to the people around them will keep erupting through conversations about disability, through conversations about aging. And I think really distinctly for all women, because even in the case of a wanted pregnancy, what happens when you're pregnant is that pregnancy is hard on all women to different proportions and to different degrees and in different ways. But we build a legal system that kind of assumes that obviously it's not, because if it were, it would be too bad to be contemplated. And part of how women make the case for their own equality is trying to actively make private or cover up or pay to conceal the things that make us different from men. And so we wind up in the US not only not having a maternal or paternal leave policy nationally, which is horrendous, but there isn't really strong protection in the law for women during pregnancy. There's protection for keeping your job, which is good. But we don't have the kind of robust leave policy that would be sensitive to the fact that a significant portion of women have HG, have disabling nausea during pregnancy. And instead, we have the sense of, well, basically everyone's autonomous most of the time. At the very beginning of life and at the very end, not so much. And maybe that implicates whether you can live or other people can decide that, but mostly it's okay. And if you dip down too far, it's very important we all not acknowledge that and that you or your friends actively cover up that fact. And that's what disturbs me so much, where I think I can both find common ground with people who disagree with me on abortion, but then hopefully pull them over to agree with me on abortion, which is there's just something profoundly untrue and unjust about starting our articulation of what it means to be a human person in autonomy and independence. It's not a definition babies can meet, but it's not a definition most of us can meet for large periods of our life. And if we want to build a just society, we need to start with a true account of the human person.
But there is a thing, and this is, I think, the issue. You're absolutely right that there is no way that an infant or a fetus definitely can make a claim to autonomy or independence or any of those things. But there is something about a woman that she can. And it does seem to me that, as I say, to my mind, the notion of how a woman feels about her own pregnancy is, and I use that term glibly, but actually if you unpick it, it is her own pregnancy. And we talk about, community, but nobody feels what that woman feels because only she is pregnant, and nobody can share that with her until the baby is born, which is why I think many of us put a huge emphasis on being born. It's not just that, it's not that a baby can make a claim of independence or autonomy in any profound sense, but other people can then intervene. But before then, to basically say that a woman cannot make a decision about what she thinks is right for her and her family is to place on her a burden that is different to a woman that is not pregnant. And I don't think that there's anything about a woman that changes about her herself that changes when she's pregnant, which is why I think that ultimately she has to make the decision, because we can talk about justice. I don't think you can really draw parallels between employment and pregnancy. I think there is that thing that pregnancy is a very unique circumstance, that you have one human life inside another human life. The embryo, the fetus, is inside of the woman, and you cannot in any way give moral standing to that fetus or embryo without it affecting the moral standing of the woman who is carrying it. And so if we really do believe in the dignity of what we are as humans, and part of that dignity is drawn from our capacity to make decisions about ourselves And to have that sense of knowing that we are responsible, it almost seems to me to take that away from a woman, to say, you do not know what is the best thing. We are not going to allow you to do that. Just to me is to take away part of her humanity. And I think it is what does my head in with this, and I really grapple with this myself, is that it is this thing about context, because end of life, you're talking about a burdensomeness in a completely different way, because you're talking about a burdensomeness that is the burdensomeness that an individual places on a community and on a family. Whereas when you're talking about pregnancy, you're talking about one woman bearing 100% of it. And I find that I cannot move beyond that point. I want to join with you on this, but I can't move beyond that point.
If I may, something that I don't know how many listeners feel the same way. Something that my instincts on this question, I'm quite ambivalent on this question, as you can tell probably, is that I find, Leah, your arguments in relation to dependence, and specifically, I mean, hopefully we'll get onto this more, a lot of the pro-choice arguments seem to assume that in order to be fully free and to be fully human even, women have to be as much like men as possible. And that in a way, women's vulnerability, if we want to call it that, to pregnancy, is some sort of error within women. And that if only we could rectify that through easy availability of contraception and abortion, then the feminist point, that on that theoretical level, I'm so with you. I'm like, yes. And I can also see on a more sociological level that the legalization of abortion and the availability of contraception has changed the broader cultural attitudes towards sex and towards relationships and towards children and towards obligations to one another. I think that is generally to be regretted. I'm sure we'll get more into this. But the point where I so theoretically I'm so there, and then I come up against this really practical question of, if I imagine myself as a lawmaker, and as discussed, I have this really quite modern technology, I have the ability within my power to grant some women access to not completely, but very, very safe abortions. You can just end the pregnancy, you go home tomorrow and you're fine. How do I really feel withholding that from women in the hard cases or girls in the hard cases? Can I actually bear to say, no, I could give this to you, but I'm not going to, 10-year-old who is pregnant by her abusive father, or woman who has been raped in wartime, or, I can list a million terrible, terrible examples where the woman is going to deeply suffer from this pregnancy. And Anne makes this point, and it's so true, that it is 100% her suffering. It cannot be shared in the community. You cannot have a break from it. You cannot discharge any of your obligations in that moment because it's all on you and your body. And I don't know how many other listeners feel the same way, but I'm theoretically pro-life and I'm practically pro-choice. And I'm not sure how to reconcile that.
To pose one question back at you, I think for large swaths of human history, someone could have framed that same hard cases question back at you about post-birth infanticide, where it's not just the burden of pregnancy
it's
that's
true
hard for women. In these cases, and I'd really point particularly to the example of rape, because I think it is one of the hard cases that people are uncomfortable talking about. It's the continuing sense of violation, the co-option of one's body. But, if a woman doesn't succeed at receiving an abortion early on, what people want in many cases is not just, well, as long as someone else is raising the baby my rapist conceived with me, I feel fine as long as the pregnancy is out of the way. Or if we had artificial wombs, I'd feel total peace about transplanting the baby. People feel a real sense of horror and implication in the continuing life of the baby. And rape is the hardest case, but I think that's true broadly. We look at the Turnaway study of women who miss abortions, don't pick adoption for the most part, right? They're not just seeking to avoid the burdens of pregnancy, but once that's priced in, then they don't want to raise the baby. People have a real connection to their children as long as they're born, but in many times and places, because of economic concerns, because of social concerns, because of how the baby was conceived, one of the solutions was exposure, not adoption. And I think you could make any of the arguments you've just made to me about how intimate and how different it is for the mom versus anyone else to have a baby walking around who is her child, conceived in these circumstances, even unknown to her. It's an ongoing burden. And it has been, in many times and places, a strong enough case to end that baby's life after it's taken their first cry. And so for me, it's the same logic in both cases, with the attendant suffering in both cases, but that we err on the side of all the people who are human, and understanding that when a grievous crime is committed against a woman, one of the consequences is a living one, but we can't do justice to her by visiting further violence on someone who is innocent.
But don't you think it's interesting that there has never been, that as far as I'm aware, there has never been a movement of people who are saying we want infanticide.
Well, there has
In the
historically,
cases
right?
of rape or violence. Yeah, no. Let me put this. Let me row back from there has never been, which is a bit of a stupid thing to say. In modern Western democracies, we have had around the world a movement of people saying that for one reason or another, they think that it should be possible to regulate fertility. But I'm not aware of any similar movement around infanticide. And I think
Can I bring one up that is present?
Yeah, go on. No, go on. Yeah,
So
go on. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say disability.
No, though I think that is one of them, right? Like there is an active, contingent led by Peter Singer, though I think he's more fringe, right? He does advocate that parents should have the right to end the life of disabled children after birth. I think they're soft infanticide of just the reluctance to provide medical care to children who might live for longer. No, I was going to say it's in India, where not only is there sex selective abortion, but that it's common for hospitals to have a term, a code pink, for a baby who's born medically fragile, whose parents deliberately take her home because she's a girl, so that she will die at home rather than receive care. And that is, a society-wide trend towards infanticide support for infants, to the point where the hospital has to have a private code to say, can we dissuade them from taking her home? Because she'll live if they let us treat her, and they want us to stop. They don't want us to save her life.
But I think then we'd probably agree that that is a very specific, a very culturally specific sort of example. What I'm really trying, I think, to get to is that these decisions, I think, around pregnancy are incredibly context specific. And I think that one of the things that I've found very difficult over the years is that what happens is that there's a debate that happens on an abstract level about abortion, where, from what I'm understanding, what you're saying, and I think this holds together as an argument, that as we begin to devalue life in its earlier stages, so we also devalue life in its later stages, and you have this blurring of lines around what it is to be human, and that there is something that is wrong in that. And in the abstracts, I agree with you on a philosophical level. What is very different is a point I was hinting at earlier, is that insofar as abortion exists, it's not carried out for a principle or a statement, or in a woman's mind, it's not related to issues of equality or justice. It's about her dealing with a very, very, very specific situation. It's a bit like if you took the example in philosophy of the trolley problem. 5 people, are you going to be responsible for the deaths of 5 people or 1 person? In the utilitarian mind, you always need to opt out for the one person because you're causing less suffering. But if your child is one of the 5 people in the other truck, you might be thinking about that very, very differently. And I think that within the practicality of pregnancy, that's the difference. It's that it's very possible for us to stand outside and say, well, we think that this is kind of a bad thing. But when you hone down onto the personal and the specific, which is how abortion always presents itself, it becomes different. And I think that's why, Louise, you get a kind of problem that it's a bit like, in theory, you want to be pro-life, but practically, when you have that woman who is begging in desperation because she doesn't feel that she can handle it, you kind of feel slightly differently about it. And I think that is generally the problem that exists in the debate. It's how we pull together a kind of humane approach to it. And it's basically why, as I say, for me, it's just become very, very simple. It's just become one of who decides. It needs to be the pregnant woman. Ultimately, somebody has to make a decision. Might be right, it might be wrong, but to my mind, the person who has to make the decision is the individual who is going to bear the consequences of it. So we can have a debate, but I prefer the idea of privately allowing people to do what they think is in line with their conscience. That's, to me, the most dignified way of dealing with it.
This episode is sponsored by Relay, one of those brands that's just such a perfect fit with MMM. I think what they're doing is excellent. Relay is an app that helps people stop using porn. And let's be honest, porn is basically everywhere on the internet. Most men see it first as teenagers. It quietly becomes part of life. But over time, it leaves a mark. You're more distracted, less present, less patient. It eats away at integrity, makes secrecy feel normal, and creates distance in your relationships. Many men feel stuck in the cycle, ashamed, frustrated, and wondering if change is even possible. That's where Relay comes in. It's therapist accredited and built on solid therapeutic principles, but the real difference is that you're no longer fighting alone. Relay places you in a private group with other men on the same journey, giving you daily accountability, encouragement, and tools to handle triggers whenever they pop up. You can stay totally anonymous while getting the real support you need to build a life of integrity. It's about becoming the husband, the father, the man that you were meant to be. Relay has already transformed the lives of thousands of men and the lives of their partners. Don't let the pattern continue. You don't have to stay stuck. Go to joinrelay.app/Maiden and use the code Louise, that's all capital letters Louise, to try it out for free. That's joinrelay.app/Maiden. Can I ask, Anne, would you support restricting abortion on any grounds in terms of term limit, in terms of, say, sex selective abortion is often given as an example?
Yeah.
What's your policy preference? And Leah, I'll ask the same thing. Like, rather late in the piece, but so we have a more practical basis on which to disagree.
Okay. If it were me, what I would say is that, being consistent with the point I've made earlier about why I think it should be the pregnant woman who decides, what I honestly believe is that the circumstances should be determined by a woman and her doctors. I'm a freedom of conscience sort of absolutist for doctors on this. I think that if a doctor doesn't want to be involved in abortion, they should be able to object to being involved in abortion. And so it's putting those two things together. A late abortion requires doctors and clinical staff who are prepared to perform it. I think if there is a medical team who thinks that there is a compelling reason sufficient that they will be involved in that abortion, the woman, then it should be down to them, not to external forces. And one of the reasons why I say that is because I don't believe that things significantly change in the moral value of the fetus from 1 week, one day to the next, as Leah said. And I find it bizarre that people will be for abortion at 6 weeks, but against it at, say, 26 weeks, just because the fetus looks more like a baby. That seems to me to be pathetically trivial. But what I also think is that, again, this is all context. I was horrified when I was researching late abortions that had taken place in Britain under the law to come across a case of a woman who'd had her pregnancy terminated at 38 weeks, which was the time that I delivered my much, much wanted and loved son. You're kind of grappling with this. Is this woman the most monstrous person you could ever think of? Or was she in the most unbelievably, in circumstances that were so unimaginably appalling, that she would make that decision? So I kind of made it my business to talk to people who worked in fetal abnormality units. And one of them was explaining to me that if, for example, you will sometimes have a child that would be born and it's got a condition maybe where its skin isn't formed possibly, and when it's out of the womb, it's going to be in, I suppose, agony, and has no chance of living, then it isn't actually unheard of for women to want to keep that pregnancy going as long as possible, because they love that baby within them and they want to keep it there. So to my mind, it's like, that to me was a real lesson in is that woman a terrible woman? No. Should that abortion have taken place earlier? No. We just have to be, we have to, I think, be a bit generous in why things happen and realize that it is such a context-specific thing that doctors and women should be trusted to make that decision, and they know better than Parliament or policymakers. That's my view on it. So that's why I'm characterized as being the woman who believes there should be no time limits on abortion. That's why.
But then I guess the moral backstop you have in there is doctors. So she has to be able to persuade at least one doctor to agree with her. So it's not just that woman who might have
with very late abortion, more than that.
Right. Yeah. So there's a degree of consensus.
You don't get away with that with the abortion pill either, because actually, when you get to later gestation abortions, you need medical care.
Yeah, it's actually a really significant surgical procedure. Leah, what is your preferred policy in concrete terms?
I do prefer a broad ban on pretty much all abortions. I favor life-saving care for moms who need it, which can vary in terms of whether that is, an abortion, an early delivery, treatment of ectopic pregnancy. When the mom's life is in danger, doctors should try and save whichever patient they can save, and that's the mom in those early cases. But I do kind of differentiate that, and most American laws differentiate that from an abortion where the object of the procedure is that the baby not survive it. Versus if you have a mom with premature rupture of membranes, you both can deliver the baby early, even knowing they won't survive, for the sake of saving her life and sparing her from sepsis. And I think that's appropriate and should be legal. But everyone in the room, you've got a mom at 20 weeks is rooting she's going to make it to 22 and maybe have a chance of delivering the baby alive. So I think that's just a very different procedure because the ends are different. I favor strong restrictions. I'm not going to get them anytime soon in America. We're a democracy. I've got to persuade people bit by bit to agree to these, which is what I'm here to do. I think some of the easier compromises are strong restrictions on elective post-viability abortion or peri-viable abortion. And I think that's less commonly accepted in the US, but if a baby would be likely to survive in 2 weeks and you've been pregnant this long, even if you don't want to raise the baby, I think it's appropriate to restrict abortion, wait, deliver the baby, whatever best early induction you can to give the baby a chance, even if the mom doesn't want to be pregnant all the way till full term, rather than say, we're going to kill the baby deliberately. I do favor strong restrictions on sex selective and disability targeting abortions, though I think they're very hard to put into law because the doctor, if you have a regime that allows abortions for many reasons, it's hard for the doctor to know the reason the parents are seeking one is sex selection. And we've seen that countries that try to put sex selective abortion restrictions in place have a lot of trouble making them stick, even when they try and ban sex testing. It's just practically very difficult. Where I'd most like to see pressure in the near term is on the doctors who do genetic counseling, who are the ones giving news of a baby with a disability, that they not strongly steer towards abortion. Because I've known moms who got a hard diagnosis and the doctor never even brought up the idea of keeping the baby. It's, oh, well, we have these results, so when should we schedule the termination? There's an organization I really like. This is less something that you do purely through the law, but it's called Hope Story. And it connects parents who receive a Down syndrome diagnosis with parents raising a child with Down syndrome. And they connect doctors too, because just for many doctors to deliver the news your baby has Down syndrome, they've never met a child with Down syndrome because they've only seen the ultrasound and then they've given the counseling that led the parent to end the life of that child. I guess the legal thing that I could get here is just more of a counseling requirement that people get connected to someone so that they have a vision of what their life might look like rather than just a no they receive from a doctor. But in the long run, I want us to ban abortion and I want us as a nation to feel good about it, not as though I've gotten one over on my fellow women, right? Because I think I liked your approach, Anne, of like, are these bad people doing this? No, they weren't bad people in Rome either. They weren't people who had no idea what a baby were or were hideously callous towards other human beings. If I met a Roman woman, including a woman who had lost a baby to infanticide, I bet I wouldn't know that by talking to her. There wouldn't be this moral monstrous that revealed herself. She lived embedded in a society that drew an unjust line between who was and wasn't a person, and she tried to act justly mindful of that line. That's the moral error I think we're making. And because the Romans stopped, I think we can stop too.
The great tragedy of this whole problem is that, as is often noted by feminists, the suffering of pregnancy is almost exclusively focused. I mean, men do suffer psychologically in relation to unwanted pregnancies and abortions and so on. But in terms of the physical suffering, it is all on the woman. She can't share it. Mm-hmm. The other thing that is so tragic, though, is that the suffering suffered by individuals is so unevenly distributed. Like thinking, for instance, of thinking again of myself as the lawmaker holding in my hands access to safe legal abortion and giving or withholding it. The case that I really struggle with is a woman who, say, has been given a terrible diagnosis for her baby, her much wanted baby, the baby who is not going to survive birth, for instance, or is going to only be able to survive with incredibly intensive medical care and in conditions of great suffering and will never live obviously we all live lives of dependency, but like some more than others, and a baby who will never have any access to a normal life and will experience terrible pain. I find it so hard to imagine that woman having to go around with her enormous bump and being asked constantly, what are you having? When is it due? And she says, I'm sorry, the baby's going to die as soon as, what, just for me, I find the idea of saying, no, I'm sorry, we have the medical technology. I cannot relieve you of the suffering of this much wanted baby who is not going to have the life you would hope for. What I can relieve you of at least is the next few months of that physical pain and that social pain and that psychological pain. And I find it hard to say no in that instance. And to some extent, this is a problem generated almost by the existence of safe abortion. Like in the ancient Roman example, no one could give or withhold that because it just didn't really exist as an option. Like you basically had to go through with the pregnancy and then either expose the baby or not, but there was no exit that you could just take. And now there is. And I think I know what the Christian attitude towards this unequal distribution of suffering is. But I guess for a secular audience and secular people listening, how, Leah, would you make this case for being able to look that problem in the eye without giving in and just handing over the goods, handing over the abortion rights?
I think one of the things is just that kind of intense suffering that feels invisible, or the things that draw attention to it heighten it because people are unaware of what we're going through, is more common. You're kind of pointing at a really strong example, but part of what I think about is that as I live in a city, I walk through the metro, I walk through the streets, I might walk by a woman who's visibly pregnant and have the instinct to say congrats, and it's a hard time for her. I'm also working, a desk or two away from someone whose mom has a cancer diagnosis. There's just more suffering throughout the world than we think. And we have this instinct of how can we find and contain and remove and make small the suffering that exists? And where we can comfort people or ameliorate suffering, that's one thing. But when we do it by removing the suffering person is where I'm really suspicious. I think it's good that people know that there are pregnant women walking around with a bump for whom congratulations is a mixed comment, right? And that we approach each other with this sense of the fragility of each of our lives. So what I want is not to end the baby's life prematurely. I don't want to say it's not kind of salt in the wound to look like you're rejoicing and then not really be rejoicing. But I think that's just a more common experience than we think. And the more we acknowledge it and talk about it, the better prepared we are to care for each other. I have walked around pregnant, though not visibly pregnant, knowing my baby was dying. And what I wanted most in those times was not, I wish the baby had died even sooner so I had less of this time of kind of mingled grief and motherhood. I wanted more people to know, right? And I want a culture where that's more normal. I know it's normal for many people not to tell folks they're pregnant for fear of miscarriage. Because I've had 6 miscarriages, my husband and I have always prioritized telling the people we love because we know we may have a very short period of time where we can share joy with people before it's overtaken by grief. And I think the more that we're willing to be vulnerable in that way and to welcome the vulnerability of others rather than say, well, if grief comes, then it was a mistake to share this, the more humane we are, whatever happens to the baby.
I think that's really wise. But the problem is we cannot, or at least I do not think we can impose those personal ways of viewing things and dealing with things on to other people who have a very, very, very different value set and who don't see things in quite that same way. And it seems to me that it's a little bit that, like the discussion that we were having earlier, that if we could paint the canvas of life in different shades, then we might do so. But the way that things are right now, women are very often on their own with these particular decisions. And I can't get away from the fact that that woman will talk to her family, will talk to her networks, will share or not share what she herself feels that she needs to share, and that she needs to be able to come to the decision that is right for her in those circumstances. And we might even wish that she had made a different decision. But do you not think it has to ultimately be hers? Whether she buys into the vision that you have, or whether she says, well, no, that's just actually not me. I really don't think I can manage this. This is the way that I have to manage it. Because, it seems to me it's a little bit like I wanted a child more than anything. And it sounds as though we share something in having a complicated reproductive history of miscarriages, and I had infertility and a whole load of things. And then suddenly, unexpectedly, I had a totally unplanned pregnancy and dealt with a lot of the kind of, oh my God, I'd spent so long wanting to be pregnant. It was almost difficult to get my head around the fact that I was. But for me, there were a whole lot of feelings that nobody could possibly have shared or understood what myself and my husband were going through. And we chose to deal with that in a particular way. And I think that's great that we were able to do that. And I think people have to manage their private lives privately. It's, as I say, I have a massive presumption in favor of life, and partly it may be shaped by my experience. But other people are not me. So let them do what they think is right for them. I think.
I think part of what's hard is that in a fully, neutral, pluralistic society, it is harder to have accommodation for grief or mourning or recognizing the personhood
Yeah.
of the baby if the statement of the law and the statement of the culture is it's a baby to some people, but not to others, and everyone should just kind of figure it out for themselves. And then there is less accommodation for grief and for women trying to carry a baby with a hard diagnosis term, because the assumption is, well, everyone knows you're allowed to get rid of the baby. You are making a weird personal choice in continuing, and we're maybe not obliged to, make space for you at work or anything else, because now this is a personal choice, not a natural response to the death of a person.
But it's certainly really hard for somebody to have to put up with the fact that they can't make the decision that they see is absolutely the right one for themselves and their children, because other people feel that it's somehow indicative of what should happen. And I think that what you point to is absolutely right. We in society today, I feel, have got endlessly strong opinions of how other people should make decisions about their their personal lives. Personal lives have somehow become public statements. I didn't choose to have a child because I thought everybody else should have children. And there are lots of people who chose not to have children who love other people's children but just didn't want it themselves. And we don't have to see everything as being instrumental in setting parameters. So I feel myself quite capable of saying, as I said to you, nobody should be forced to have an abortion. We should make the case for people to have all of the access to the additional services and support without saying that people have to continue their pregnancy. I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive. I think that if you if you honestly believe, and I honestly believe that you do, and I don't quite know how I deal with this question, that the embryo has exactly the same value and the same personhood as a born person, then obviously you are going to be 100% against all abortions. And I think the way that you describe your own position makes sense to me and is completely right. I am struggling because I have an enormous sense of the value of human life from its inception. I really do. But at the same time, I can't allow myself to compel another woman to live by, I suppose, that same perception. And it's hard. It requires tolerating other people to form their own moral standards somehow.
Can I ask one last question before I let you both go? And thank you, both of you, for being so thoughtful and respectful and interesting. Honestly, it's been such an interesting conversation to listen to and participate in. A last question, because I don't think that we've really touched on this as much as I would have liked. How has the ready availability of abortion and the very widespread use of it, I mean, I'm sure you both know, but listeners might not know that I think in the UK it's something like 1 abortion to every 2.5 live births. So we are talking about very large numbers of abortions. And 1 in 3 women have had one at some point. These are big numbers. How has the ready availability of abortion changed the status of women? So not just women who have had abortions, but all women. How has this affected us, for good and ill? I imagine your answers will be slightly different, but maybe Leah, if I could turn to you first, because I know that you've often written and thought and spoken about this.
Yeah, I think to some extent, it's a funny question to answer because abortion has been legal and broadly available my whole life, right? So I've always lived in a culture where expectations of women and for women were shaped by the sense abortion was on the table. One of the things that it shaped in my life. I grew up pro-choice. I was a donor to Planned Parenthood. I think because of the tenor of debates in the United States, it really shaped my expectations about pregnancy and childhood. And so one thing that was a big surprise to me when I was first pregnant and using the bump app to, track week by week was what fetal development is like, what a baby is like, because I had grown up with the clump of cells framing. And I think, there are ways in which, in America's debate in particular, a lot of the framing of the necessity of abortion is framed around babies as threats to women. And I think if what we prize most of all is autonomy, is not being made weak by anything, it is descriptively true. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg is right. Babies are threats to women's ability to do anything, right? Being pregnant meant I said no to things, meant I was sick at times. And I think that sense of other people's needs encroaching on your real life doesn't stay contained to pregnancy. And I do think it cuts against the willingness to take a risk on a child or take it as early as you might want to, even when you're married and planning to have kids, but waiting. This sense of your real life is interrupted by other people's needs, and you should try and contain or delay those interruptions as long as possible. And that's a realistic thing to want or achieve.
Anne, what do you think?
I think that it has certainly impacted on the way that, particularly, I think this generation views pregnancy and having children as being a phenomenal, deliberate step into the unknown that is sometimes too terrifying to make. And I think that that's because it's given us the idea that we have absolute control over whether we can do something, and pregnancy doesn't just happen anymore and you don't have to think about it. It's like it has become something that is a very deliberate, planned decision, which at one time I would have said that's a really great thing. But then what I think now is that somehow it is almost seen as being an unnatural thing to do. It's become such a kind of leap and demonstration of confidence that people just keep putting it off and off and off because they don't feel that they can get there, and then times pass them by. So I think that is a kind of, it's almost like there's been a combination of a technical ability to make a deliberate choice about parenthood, combining with a massive inability for young people to feel that they are confident and capable enough of meeting it. So I think that's got a lot to do with why birth rates have fallen, which I don't think is a really good thing. It's also, I think, that the notion that biology doesn't exist anymore and have any power anymore has kind of come out of it as well. And there's somehow been a loss of what it actually is to be a woman, and what it is to be a woman is somehow connected deeply to maternity and our ability to become mothers, whether we are or aren't. And so this whole notion of the right to choose what to do with my body has become kind of, to my mind, nuttily broadened out. And I think that is a problem. So I think that we're in a really weird moment of history. All through my career, in many ways, the right to choose was about the right to choose whether or not to have a child, and the right to have some control over your family life and so on. And I think now what's happened is that there's somehow been an explosion of concepts and a spilling out into all other areas, which I actually think is very unhealthy and problematic. So for me, it's all about trying to recalibrate my thinking and work out how it all works. Life has become more complicated. That's one thing.
There you go. You've done my job for me, Anne. That's a nice sentence to end on. Again, thank you both so much for being so thoughtful. It's a very difficult thing to talk about, and I hope that listeners feel like we've done it justice, at least in terms of showing appropriate gravity to the subject. So thank you both.